Today, I am speaking to Daniel Hulme. Now, Daniel is an AI expert. He is the Chief AI Officer at WPP. He's the CEO of Satalia, which he founded himself about 15, 17 years ago. And he is this authority figure on AI. And I've got to be honest, I don't know much about AI. And I'm a little bit scared of it, like the next person. I like ChatGPT. That's about as far as it goes. But what was so brilliant about this conversation for me was coming into it wanting things in layman's terms. Like, what does it mean to me? Speaking to an expert in AI and saying, actually, how does this affect me and impact me? And what is so refreshing and reassuring is that Daniel does bring the conversation back round to humans at all times. But you will get an education here, and it will be interesting for you to think about your dynamics of your teams and humans, the human capacity to make wise decisions, and how that might actually be a bit limited. We might need AI to help us with that. Let's dive in. So, Daniel, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. It's Friday, crawling my way to the
Yes.
end of the week.
And we've already had a little brief chat. So, Daniel is a UCL major, and I went to King's College, and we're kind of, I belong to the UCL rejects basically. So there's always been a bit of a kind of derby, isn't there, between Kings and UCL? But
There is.
we're going to be connected for the conversation. Excellent. Um, so Daniel, what does extraordinary leadership mean to you?
It's a really good question because when I started my company 17 years ago, I was very interested in decentralized organizations, and my kind of hypothesis is that everybody has leadership characteristics and traits. And I sort of realized that what I needed to do was get out of people's way to allow them to demonstrate those traits. So I think that extraordinary leadership is getting out of people's way, removing blockers, and also giving them the resources and the fertile ground to do what they do best.
Oh, I love that. How do you create fertile ground?
I think giving people the freedom to operate, giving people access to resources, the opportunity to connect with each other, to fluidly move around the organization, to remove constraints, really. If you look at my company now, 17 years later, we have very little process. And you do need processes to actually organize yourselves in decentralized ways because they're more complicated than hierarchical structures. But I think the key goal for me is figuring out how do we create an organizational structure that enables the best group of diverse experts to make the decision. Hierarchies are typically made in decisions are typically made in hierarchies, which I think are dysfunctional. What's interesting is that AI is enabling these fluid, weighted, liquid structures.
Well, let's dive in. AI is your speciality. So, how is AI helping business organization?
Well, I guess there are three aspects of applying AI to an organization. One is how can it help improve core productivities? How can it help you write emails faster and prettier PowerPoint slides? And Google and Duet and Microsoft Copilot and these tools will be embedded in our day-to-day applications will allow people to unlock that core productivity. I don't think it will differentiate businesses. Everybody will benefit from those productivity improvements, but I think it's necessary. The second is how can AI be used to differentiate your supply chain? How can we build innovations that allow us to be better, more effective, more efficient than our competitors, which is what I'm interested in primarily. And the third is, will AI completely disrupt my industry? Now, some industries are immune to the disruption of AI. If you're growing things, if you're distributing goods, manufacturing things, AI is not really going to speed up that process. But if you're creating content like we do in WPP, we create almost a third of the world's ads. If you can now do that in seconds instead of weeks, that is disruptive. So you should also be looking at how can AI completely disrupt my industry rather than just accelerating my digital transformation.
Wow. So, can we just dive into those three areas a little bit? So, I'm a bit of an AI novice. So, I'm going to be like a nodding dog going, oh, yes, of course. But I might need you to unpack it a little bit for me. Okay. So, first of all, helping improve our core productivities. So that's an area I work in with leaders and businesses a lot is time management, self-management, task focus management. How how can businesses step more proactively into that space rather than it just being a small function within the business, like the IT function that's just trying to help a few people do it? How can people lean into that more for their productivity and core processes?
I think there's a relatively boring answer to this, which is,
Oh God.
well, we get excited about new emerging technologies. 8 years ago, it was machine learning, it was data science. Now it's generative AI. What happens is that every time there's a new emerging technology, then we try and apply that technology to solving frictions across our organization. And the reality is that those technologies are not always right to be applied to those frictions. And what happens is that there's a misinvestment. People blame the technologies. They say there's a bubble. But the reality is it's human beings not really thinking rationally about how to apply these technologies. So the boring answer is that I always start out with identifying the frictions. What frictions do you have across your organization, from productivity frictions to supply chain frictions? List those frictions, and then I've got this very nice framework that allows you to then map the right AI technologies to solving those frictions. So rather than trying to apply one type of new technology to solving them all, how do you map that technology to addressing those frictions? And then how do you prioritize those frictions according to the value to you? How much will it cost to solve that friction? Do you have the data? What's my return on investment? All of the boring business case ones. But what I would argue you do then is you figure out how to address each one of those frictions one by one and build your IT infrastructure over time. Don't start with a data lake and Tableau and thinking that's going to solve all your problems. Literally start with the frictions and ask yourself, is this something that I want to build to solve? Is it something that I can buy from a third party, build with a third party? That's it.
I think there's a real sense of logic in that and rationale that you might identify lots of frictions, but actually to fix that friction is going to cost you more hassle and effort to fix it than the friction's actually causing. So you might as well just let there be some tension points, right?
Indeed. Yeah.
And also you've touched on a very natural human behavior where there's a FOMO piece, isn't there? Of like, oh, there's something new and shiny. I want to get in on the action. Quick, let's sheep dip. Let's do everything to do with this, and without actually thinking, is this progress? Is this help? So if you're helping a business discover frictions, you've told me that there's a mapping system for AI to apply to those frictions, but how do you help a business identify their frictions?
I mean, this is the art of consulting, really. It's understanding how to ask the right questions to identify what type of frictions they are, and understand the full scope of that problem. Over the past 10 or so years, I've been developing frameworks to help understand how to identify frictions that are ripe for technology to solve. So, for example, I've got this pyramid which goes from data to information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And so, for example, data is just stuff. It's bits and bytes, ones and zeros. It's a sound that's going into your ears. It's the light that's going into your eyes. Turning stuff into information is actually it's not easy. If I say to you that John read the letter to Mary, then that's sound that's going into your ears. So John read the letter to Mary. You will have a picture in your mind of probably a guy, John, reading a letter out loud to Mary. Now, the fact is that data, that noise, can be interpreted in many ways. John could be reading a letter that was addressed to Mary or sent to Mary. He could be reading a letter of the law to Mary. He could be reading the alphabet, A, B, C, D to Mary. He could be reading a book called A Letter to a Lady Called Mary. So it could be actually interpreted in many ways. So even just turning data into information is hard. Turning information into knowledge, so extracting insights, is also a challenge. And and then ultimately going to the top, which is making decisions. And I would pretty much always start out with the frictions where you have decision-making problems to make, because usually human beings are solving them. And if I'm honest, usually human beings are solving them badly. So then I've got this other framework to then say is, okay, I've got this decision problem in my organization that's currently being solved by human beings as a friction. How do I then apply AI to alleviating that friction? And I've got these other framework to help you understand how to map those technologies to those frictions.
Oh, you're speaking to someone that loves a framework and a model. I'm like, I want to see them all. Just going back to that initial one, so because it's news, it's old news to you, but to me it's pretty fresh, and I know for my listeners it will be. So I know it's a triangle, isn't it? And so the base of the triangle is this data. So that's just the information that we are receiving, the words, the sounds, the noises. That's the data. The information we extrapolate from that. How do you define information?
Information is data in context. If I say to you,
Data in business.
210280, this is data. If I say that it's a date of birth or how much money I have in my account,
Got it.
it becomes information. So
it's applied to a context.
Essentially it's an axiom. It's a truth, an aspect, an element of truth. And from those elements of truths, you can then start to extract more insights, which would be knowledge.
Got it. So that's where you get your insight. So the data is the words about the book being read to Mary. The data the information you might then give me is that it is a man with his wife is in bed sick. Yeah. So then that gives you a bit of context, right?
Yeah.
So then the insights I get, the knowledge I then get from that, if we're following that example through, might be, I mean, this is a question, might be, oh, he sounds like a caring husband or a caring partner to be reading to his wife. Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that's knowledge. What's the next tier up? Wisdom.
Understanding. So how do I then understand that correlation? I guess maybe I'll give you a slightly different example, but
yeah, go on.
If I show you an ad with a black cat, I can use machine learning to predict the clicks, likes, and sales. So I know that I'm probably going to get these clicks, likes, and sales, but I don't understand why. But what machine learning can do, if you implement it correctly, it can say, Daniel, if you change that from a black cat to a ginger cat, you're going to get more clicks, likes, and sales because that person likes Garfield. So understanding that person likes Garfield will make them more, attentive, more likely to buy things. That's the understanding layer. And then the decision-making layer, or the wisdom layer, is then using that understanding to then figure out how to maximize my sales or maximize the well-being of my employees or whatever.
How come you're using the word wisdom and decision-making in the same space?
So wisdom for me is utilizing that understanding to achieve a goal. And let me give you a slightly different example. Imagine you have 5 staff members that you need to allocate to jobs. There are actually 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 possible solutions. There's 5 factorials, 120 possible ways to allocate 5 people to 5 jobs. If I've got 15 people to allocate to 15 jobs, there are now 1 trillion solutions, 15 times 14. If I've got 60 people to allocate to 60 jobs, there are now more solutions than there are atoms in the universe. This is a decision-making problem. And I need to be able to understand or utilize people's skills, their relationships, all of the understanding and knowledge bit to be able to then make good decisions. And decision making is a completely different field in computer science. It's a different set of algorithms. It's not generative AI. It's not machine learning. So that's why I go to this other framework to help us understand, okay, my decision problem is how do I allocate people to work to maximize happiness or well-being? How do I then solve that problem? Is it a machine learning problem? Is it an optimization problem? Or is it a generative AI problem?
I mean, everything you've just said, I understood, but it was so fast, and my brain was like, what just happened? Because in layman's terms, what I have just processed is that when you're thinking about people and assigning jobs and approaches and tasks, there are so many dynamics to consider that the human brain probably can't conceive them all. So if I have 5 people with 5 tasks, I'm just like, oh yeah, Becky works well with Richard works well with them, we've done some team stuff on this. It's quite a basic way of a limited and limited approach to thinking what is the best outcome for these tasks. Whereas if I was to bring in AI, it would consider how many options did you say there would be?
Well, it depends. If you've got 60 people to allocate to 60 jobs, there are more solutions than there are atoms in the universe.
Well, that's just bonkers, and the human brain or any consultant wouldn't be able to come up with all of those options.
No,
but
that's why you need to use algorithm.
Yes, I'm hearing that. So let's say I was running a team of 5 people.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be so slick. I'm a startup and I'm wanting to scale it, and we're going to grow fast. What do I do? How do I start tapping, apart from phoning you?
I think actually, for the most part, humans are quite good at solving problems up to 30 or 40. We can get pretty good solutions. Beyond 30 or 40, if you really care about that utilization, and then the way that we approach things in my company is that we do 2 things. We use generative AI machine learning to build models of employees. So I can create a large language model that's trained on your digital footprint, your email, your calendar, your Slack, your feedback. So I can feed all of that information into a model, and I can use that model to then ask, if I put you on this team, will you work well? If I put you on this project, will you thrive? I can even ask it what utilization you have, available, what skills development needs you might have. And but I have that knowledge in this model, but then I need to figure out how do I allocate you to work, and that's a different type of algorithm. So what we're starting to see now is these models representing, or digital twins of employees that are trained on their digital footprints being used as an information source, but then we're using those to also figure out how to allocate them to work. So let me give you a slightly different example. One of the things that I used to do in my company before I realized it was illegal is that we used to get everybody to make public recommendations for their salary. So everybody would publicly declare what they want to be paid. People would then vote on whether those salaries should be reduced or increased or kept the same. And we would use AI to determine how many votes one person has for another. So if I've worked very closely with you over the past year, if I'm very knowledgeable about your domain, and I can look at the data and see that, then I will have more votes for your salary than somebody else.
Got it.
And the point here is that instead of having managers making decisions about your salary, it's the people who are best placed to make those decisions.
Oh, wow.
So we can use AI to create these weighted dynamics, weighted hierarchies, and then make sure you've got the right people making those decisions. So that was an example of where we use machine learning to profile people, and then human beings made the decision. But the fact is that human beings are not really good at making these decisions. So there are other types of algorithms out there that you can use to do that. So if I was a startup, I would start by figuring out how can I start to build digital twins of my employees. And once you start to have a digital twin of their employees, you can start to use that for all sorts of things like feedback, career development, objective setting, all that fun stuff.
So a digital twin, it would, if I was working in a company and had one, is you just assigning some kind of algorithm tech thing in my computer system to assess how I'm behaving.
It's a large language model, like a ChatGPT that's been trained on your data. So it's trying to understand and represent you based on your digital footprint.
But not based on my body language or my
social unless you had access to that information, then we can't give it to the AI. So you're absolutely right. There's a gap, right? There's body language. There's data that's being created that the AI doesn't have access to, and that's what's interesting is that when you start to have a delta of a difference in opinion. So I think I have these skills, but you think that I don't have these skills. What's missing, right? What information is missing to allow me to close that gap? In
the L&D space, I call it the intention impact gap, and it's my intention or my self-knowing has intentions, but the impact on the receiving end can sometimes be very different. So I can think I'm very knowledgeable about a subject because I read around it all the time, but the impact I'm having to you is that you don't know what you're talking about. Indeed. And so you're talking about that gap, and where AI can come in and get that data and that information in context.
Yes. And actually, there are multiple gaps you need to close. So forgive me. There's what you think about yourself.
Yeah.
There's what your peers think about you.
Right.
There's what the AI thinks about you based on your digital footprint, and there's also what numbers exist in some HR database. So there'll be some numbers somewhere that will say these are your skills, in this particular domain, and actually there'll be a delta between all of those four things. And what's interesting for me is how do you close that delta? How do you figure out what information you need to kind of get all of those four things agreeing?
So, I mean, this is really fascinating, but I'm going to ask you a question that might be really offensive and might make you cry because it's your life's work. It all sounds like a lot of work. Do you know what I mean? It also, for someone who's not in that world, but I value it, how can you break down that mindset in me that makes me go, actually, this is really easy and accessible?
Well, what we're finding is that these kind of digital twins of employees are actually being embraced by employees because they feel like their digital twin does represent them better than 5 numbers in a HR database.
Wow.
So for the most part, it's being embraced. And the fact is you can engage with your digital twin. You can talk to it. You can see how it differs from your opinion. It can talk to you. It can say, this is what I think you are, you're thinking and feeling, Daniel, or what your skill sets are. And so you can get these now 2 agents, me and the digital twin, to start talking to themselves. And you're right, maybe 3 years ago, before generative AI, it was hard to do this. You would need to build lots of different machine learning models to understand skills and relationships and influence. Now you can kind of encapsulate all of that into a single brain, into a single large language model. And so it's actually a lot easier than what people might think. And actually, I would argue that if you can start off with feedback, if you can start off by creating digital twins of employees and then asking that digital twin, what feedback needs does Daniel need? And then asking the other digital twins of the employees is, do you think that you're the right person to be able to give Daniel this feedback? Then when you can solve feedback in this dynamic way, you very, very quickly move on to skill setting. So what skills do you think you have? What skills do your peers think you have? To then salary setting, to career development, to performance. So if you can get it working for feedback, which is a relatively safe space, then very, very quickly you can use this liquid methodology to solve pretty much all of your HR needs.
So a question though, isn't the program has been written by a human, therefore it's still going to be bound in assumptions, like that information piece, the context. So for example, let me ask a question. If I wanted feedback and we were asking my digital twin to give me feedback, what feedback does Dolly need? You would then ask the digital twin, who does Dolly need to hear feedback from? Who's going to be the most effective at giving her feedback? And you will look at my digital footprint and think, like, what's the criteria? How does it know who's the best?
Indeed. Yeah. So you just let's just remind ourselves, AIs are not really programmed. They're trained. So and there's a kind of misconception here, which is I'm not telling the AI what to do. I'm giving it access to data and enabling it to look at the data to then figure out what to do. Now, it might be that I'm giving it the wrong data, so I'm making a decision to. But AIs are trained; they're not programmed for the most part. And so, for example, if I wanted to understand whether you were the right person to give me feedback on a particular subject, the way that this would work would be that I can train your digital twin on your digital footprint, your emails, as I say, your calendar, your Slack. If it turns out that lots of people are asking you questions over Slack or email about a particular subject and you're responding and they're saying, thanks, that was amazing, really helpful, then I know that you're good at giving feedback in a particular area, on a particular subject. It's not me programming, it's not me saying Dolly's really good at giving feedback. It's the statistics and the data that show me that you're good at giving that feedback. And so you should then be the right person to give me feedback because you're respected in essentially in your digital footprint.
But that data might be, going back to your information thing, that might be miscontexts. Like so it could say lots of people are coming to me for certain feedback and I'm going, here's the info, and they're like, oh, thanks, Dolly. That data might be misaligned because it might be that people are scared of me and just want to suck up to me. And actually,
I think the point here is that it's not a perfect system. But the question is it better than the alternative? Is it better than you choosing 5 of your friends to give you feedback that you know is already going to be biased? And the answer is it is going to be better. And where for example, you can start to then identify some of these differences in when you start to become more kind of data driven. So let me give you another example. So it turns out that females in my company historically undervalued themselves. They would request salaries that were lower than what they were deserved. And what would happen is that the crowd would then say, go away, come back with a bigger number. So go back and come back with a bigger number. And sometimes that would happen 2 or 3 times to get them to the point where they're actually valuing themselves in the way that the crowd values them. So that identified a bias in them that the crowd addressed. But for example, again, in my company, historically, females tend to be less vocal on digital platforms than males. So if I'm trying to determine proximity, if I'm trying to understand how closely people work together through digital interactions, then that would be biased towards males because males are more vocal on the digital platform. So, but the point is that you wouldn't be able to get it's better than the alternative, and also by being data driven, you can identify these biases, these problems in the data, and then you can address them. And you can make it smarter.
In the world of learning and development, which is sitting under HR, which is where I sit, I go and help leaders or teams with motivating people more effectively, performance management, hitting targets more effectively, are people doing the right jobs in the right seats? Um, and the ROI is the hardest thing in my sector to measure, because often it's a gut feeling and trying to get data before, during, and after. There are methods that I use for sure, but I'm just thinking in this space, what putting you on the spot, what models are there in AI to help people in my space with creating learning programs that are really, really effective and on point?
I think it depends on the domain. It depends on the industry. Depends on the
Well,
culture.
if I give you an example of what I
Yeah,
do,
yeah.
you could tell me where I could level up and add extra
I'll
insight.
try.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll try.
So yeah, you might not be able to, and then we'll just cancel the whole podcast. No, I'm joking. So if I take on a team of say 20, I generally this is very broad brushstroke. I'll get a phone call saying, "Hi Dolly, we've heard about you. We know you're good with teams. Could you come and do some work with my team? We're growing really fast, and we're all hybrid working, and we're not consistent. Some of our team members are smashing it, some aren't, and I just need them all to kind of get to the level of the top performers. Could you come and help?" So what I then say is sure, but how it works is I'll need to work with you for about 6 months. I mean, ideally longer, but everyone's fast and furious. So 6 months, I'll do what I call my scoping out first, where I want to have my own data version. I'll do a survey. I use something called performance climate systems generally, where it's a kind of a 57 questionnaire, and it gives you different data in different ways to see where the team's performing across certain areas of function, like how clear are we on goals, roles, processes, adaptability, flexibility, communication, stuff like that. So I'll do the survey. I'll also have a selection of, if there's a team of 20, I'll probably say, can I speak to 6 people for 45 minutes? Your top performers, mid performers, and low performers, to kind of just no agenda. I just want to learn what's going on. And with my questions with them will be, what's going well, what's not, what are you finding the most friction points, the hardest parts, what's stopping the company growing or your team growing? And then I'll put all that together and create a suggested pathway of learning and development and training. And it will be generally, though, in the room with me, and some coaching one-on-one, a kind of program like that. What do I do to level up?
I don't know. What do you do to level up?
Well,
I
I get
don't know.
I wonder what data
Well,
I'm not getting that could really up my game.
well, I find, if I'm honest with you, I find trying to reduce people down to 7 different parameters in terms of who they are and how they contribute, or even 30 parameters is not easy or possible. And but that, I'm skeptical about that. And so I think the best, well, we don't have performance reviews and things like that in my company. We try to apply an agile approach. So we try to apply like Scrum methodologies where you're taking on tasks, and after 2 weeks you review how you've done, and there's potentially a safe space to do retrospectives and things like that.
Nice.
But I think we know when people are struggling, and I think, going back to your point, you have a conversation with them. You're getting much more out of a conversation with somebody than trying to map somebody to a framework of 7 different parameters. And that's really where it's worked well. We don't have to have like performance reviews. We just have to have a conversation with them and say, look, is this what's going on? How can we support you? Is this the right role? If not, is there another role? If not, let's help you find a role outside the organization that's better for you and better for us. And I think that's really what you need. Yeah.
I mean, I love that, because for someone who is, AI, a specialist in AI, I love that you recognise the human in front is actually a human and so much more than just
Yeah, I mean, there's
codes
some
and
things
digits
that
and data.
ultimately the AI doesn't have access to all of the data that you have access
No.
to be able to assess whether somebody is performant, whether they're an energy giver or an energy taker.
Yeah.
It's so much rich information there that AI doesn't have access to, and I think that you solve it by having human conversations.
You do, but actually, It's now it's funny, we're switching roles, like you're the advocate for just the human and I'm like, but we need the AI. So,
Analytics, yeah.
but actually, for example, when you're, I mean, in an ideal world, we know what an ideal company would look like, and I'm sure your company is fraught with normal problems that all humans face sociologically, but that agile approach, being able to just red team, like what went well, what didn't go well, at the end of a 2 week cycle I'm really a big fan of the Scrum methodology, and you see it more and more in mainstream businesses, non-IT, non-tech. However, there are lots of companies where it is hierarchical, and that's what I inherit as a client, and it doesn't turn on a dime that day to become something more agile. Often it's very bureaucratic, and so it's working with what's in front. And something in those spaces I see a lot is the ego, and it's the self-preservation, because to fail, to be iterative, and to be experimental, it isn't part of the culture. It comes on the back of the Fordism of just like the factory line. This is how we do it, and to change that is we talk a good game, but actually the framework doesn't work for that. So you've got a lot of ego to protect from failure. And when you've got ego, and if I come in, I'm sort of, my job sometimes is a bit of an airlift. Just sort of rolls in to solve a certain time in their lifespan of performance. Actually, people hide a lot. And what's amazing, and there isn't a culture of candidness, so no one's really talking about these things, but that's where data is so brilliant, because you then have access to digits and numbers to say, actually, you think you're good at one-to-ones. I actually have here from literally, you've only done one in the past 6 months. What's going on there? Like, it just gives you permission to go straight into more effective conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. And where you can get access to the data, where the signal you feel is strong, then I agree. But I think where I struggle is where you sort of we try to performance sort of map them to 8 or 10 criteria. And but if I want to know if people are good at giving one-on-ones, you run a survey and you ask that very specific question: is this person, like, you don't try to kind of capture their entire being in an oversimplistic framework. So yeah, I think there are absolutely, of course, a need for the right analytics in the right place. Yeah.
What do we do if? What are the actual kind of mechanical things to do today if I have a team of 30, 40 people and I don't really have any digital twinning system going on, and I'm like, I want to do that. What do I do? How do I start the ball rolling?
So when you get to about 30 or 40 people, you do end up starting to put some hierarchies in place. Yep. And there's this concept called the span of control, which I think essentially it's very hard to have somebody reporting to more than 7 people reporting to somebody. So when you get to kind of 40-ish, that's like 7 to the power of 2, which means you need two layers of hierarchy. And this idea of 7 to the power of is actually quite a powerful mechanism to look at organizations and why they have certain hierarchies. I think the key for me, well, first of all, this is a cultural issue, which is, you've already alluded to this, and I think my therapist told me that something like 60% of the population have attachment disorders. So I don't know if you've learned about attachment theory.
I have, but people might not know, so to spell it out. It'd be
well, I'd highly recommend that people learn about attachment theory. But essentially, I guess people, it sounds a bit noddy, but based on your upbringing as an infant, that will strongly dictate your attachment style as an adult. And there's a nice kind of 4-quadrant matrix, of which one of those is kind of secure. You're sort of relatively stable in your ability to form and maintain relationships, whereas there are 3 others styles, and you actually find that people tend to quite easily map to these 4 quadrants. But 60% apparently of the population have a dysfunction in their attachment ability. They're not very good at they're anxious, or they are disconnected, or whatever. And our hierarchies unfortunately amplify those attachment disorders, those failings in ourselves. And so
How so?
what I
How
try
so?
to do.
That's really interesting.
Sorry? Well, by having
How so?
things like a power dynamic, right? If you've got something that's managing you, and that's a relationship, and that's a very difficult relationship sometimes, and if you're just like in a relationship, if you're anxious, then that relationship might be unstable, and so I think what I've tried to do in my organisation is to remove those hierarchies, so we don't have people reporting to people in that way. We don't have individuals making decisions about your salary. We try to crowdsource decisions, so it makes it safer for people, to allow them to essentially be more of themselves rather than trying to fit the expectations of somebody that they're reporting to. I think we know that the difference between who you are as a being and how you want to be perceived, that delta is probably a function of your anxiety. The bigger the delta, the more anxiety you're going to have. And so how do you create an organizational structure that allows people to be really who they are? And so we've worked very hard in trying to remove or not embrace processes that trigger these dynamics. And so I guess going back to your question, if you're 40, 50 people, I think my kind of favorite kind of managerial leadership style is the gardener. It's the one that provides the resources that people need to go and do their job and to get out of their way, rather than the chess master that's telling people what to do, and all that kind of stuff.
I love that. We've had a gardener on the show a few weeks ago, because I wanted to see what can we learn from ecosystems, and your garden. Rather than, I hadn't put it like that, but rather than the chess player.
Well, the point here is that once you get over humans are not very good at making decisions beyond 7. So a person that is a chess leader, they are actually not going to be very good beyond a certain size. And so, and like a garden, it's so complicated. You can't understand all the emergent things that are going to happen. You have to just make sure that you're staying on top of the ecosystem. You're identifying blockers. You're putting out fires, and providing the right nutrients for them to flourish, rather than trying to be dictatorial. Humans are not very good at making these complex decisions, but which is why I think garden and leaderships tend to work better.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I just want to close the loop on my previous question. Was if I have a team of 40 or 50 and I want to get digital twinning up and running, what do I do?
Okay, so there's a boring answer to this is make sure you use the same naming convention across all of your platforms. Saying it sounds boring, but if you've got a coding platform and a project, make sure that's the same name as the folder in your Google Drive, your Microsoft Drive. Make sure that it's the same name as your Slack channel. And so if you have this common naming convention, I've been anal about our naming convention in Satalia since the beginning. What AI can now do is it can now say, you've got this name over here in this one platform and the same name here and the same name over here. And by the way, I can bring all of the stuff that happens underneath those names, the code, the documents, the chat, and I can bring it all together into a holistic view of what's going on inside that project. So having structured naming conventions to then allow the AI to join up what's going across is fundamental. It sounds really boring, but I mean,
is that a no, but it actually sounds pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But sometimes the most obvious, simple, boring things are what maketh the man, isn't it? It's actually what builds the strength.
Because the AI won't know there's conversation happening over here in Slack is related to this code repository over here, unless you've got a way of connecting.
Yeah, so you got to help it out. Got it. But okay, so that's almost for my IT function for me to check in on that and go, can you make sure you do that? What else? How else do I implement it?
I think then, so implementing, I don't think that companies have technology problems. Sorry. I think that if you want to have a company that's going to be successful, I think that you look at the leadership's dysfunctions and recognize that it's those dysfunctions that are ultimately going to be amplified across your organization. So if I was going to be putting any energy into anything right now, it wouldn't be technology. It would be the people that have leadership positions and look at their own dysfunctions, know themselves, so that they can then be better
Yep.
leaders. And
That's so interesting.
it's not a technology problem at that stage of a company.
That's so interesting. Can you say a little bit more? So you wouldn't put your money into the technology, you put your money into the leaders.
I'd put the energy into understanding your leadership style, the dysfunctions that come with that leadership style, your personality styles. The problems that exist in pretty much any organizations are amplifications of the personalities of the leadership. So if you've got
Yep.
an organization that is not collaborative, secretive, it's probably because the leadership are not collaborative and secretive and walled gardens.
Yep.
Um, so I think that it might be that not being collaborative is the right thing to do, but you need to understand that those dysfunctions are amplifications most likely of the leadership and the policies and structures that leadership implements. So if you want to go and solve a problem, look in yourself first.
I know it's always the thing when it's what's up the river, because it's just when you're trying to come at it down the river, it's just the flow from up the river. So it always has to start at the top. I know a woman that does family coaching. She's got 5 children and is pretty extraordinary wisdom when it comes to parenting. And when she's asked to help with teenagers, she always says, not until I've had a couple of conversations, obviously, with you parents. And then they end up having loads of coaching. She doesn't even need to see the kids because she just goes straight into the parents and their dynamics.
Indeed.
And then actually, just through osmosis, it just changes down the river,
Indeed,
the function of the
I
family.
mean, I totally agree with that, and I mean, I do struggle with this concept of top, because top usually infers hierarchy, but it is the people that
Got it.
are. So in my company, we don't have we have everything's a project. Even the company strategy is a project, and it just so happens that I and some other people are the right people to be working on that project. That project is no more important or less important than a project over here that might be implementing some HR tool, or another project over here that might be delivering some solution for a client. You've just got this ecosystem of projects,
Yes.
and the sort of the bound of the project is where communication and leadership needs to be, both with inside the project but also connecting to other projects. And so I don't like this idea of top. But I do appreciate that kind of like style, the leadership traits propagate through the network.
Yeah. I mean, do you know there's a great book called Reinventing Organizations by
Yeah, I
Frederick
know it very
Whitman?
well. I
Yeah.
know
Yeah,
it
yeah,
very
yeah.
well. Yeah.
So
Teal.
that's you're very much teal.
Yeah, I think that. So I've been looking at this stuff for over a decade,
Wow.
and what I've been trying to figure out is how do you create these organizations in the age of AI? Because I think things like Teal and whatnot, they're, I think, over engineered in some respects.
Yes, interesting.
Because when you start to kind of implement these decentralized structures, there are other things you haven't thought about, and then you end up kind of patching that up with some other framework and structure, and you end up with this bit of a mess. But I actually think there's a very elegant way of structuring an organization, and at some point I'd like to probably write a book about it when I get time.
Oh, well, I'll read that.
Yeah. But it's you just going back to this concept, this fundamental concept of how do you make sure that you have the right group of experts making the decision in a non-rigid hierarchical way,
Yeah.
and also and how do you structure your organization not as a hierarchy but as a matrix? Matrices lend themselves much more naturally to kind of fluid organizations.
Do you know, I think that's just a really simple yet profound way of putting it. Like it's about having the right experts making the right decisions in the right places. Did you say?
It
Or
sounds,
just
yeah, exactly. It sounds like it's crazy, but
no, it
unfortunately,
is.
decisions are made in hierarchies, and we know that hierarchies are not necessarily the best structure for
No,
good decision making.
no, they're not. It's funny that you talk about teal. I mean, organisations, they can be a bit. sterile, trying to just create, oh, let's become more teal, let's do it, and then you're creating
Yeah.
other problems. It reminds me of that human instinct you talked about earlier of just let's get AI everywhere and let's just react suddenly. Let's all try and be a bit more teal, a bit
Yeah.
more matrix, yeah, disparate.
There's a good book that I'm just going to put on my bookshelf. It's called Humanocracy, which is again it's a
Oh yeah.
collection of other ways of structuring organisations. There's a company in China, I think, called Hair, which I think is a manufacturing company, and they don't have a hierarchy. They have these essentially squads of a maximum of 15 people that they interact with each other. And again, this more kind of ecosystem rather than
Yes.
hierarchical way.
Yeah. I mean, do you know what comes up in me? And I'll just be completely honest. And this probably means that I need loads of therapy, which I've had a bit. But my ego, I'm competitive, and I like being on the win. I like being on a team that wins, but I like being, I'm in personality. I'm red. I'm an ENTP. I like winning, and I like, there's a part of me that would be sad to only ever be in a kind of cross collaborative function space, because I would want to have moments of, yeah, I bloody did that. You know what I mean? But I'm just being completely honest.
That's I
What
think that's I think you can still have that, particularly
do you?
ultimately you have clients you have to serve, and those clients put pressures and constraints that you have to operate, and that's where the pressure comes from. I'd rather the pressure comes
Nice.
from clients rather than from internal structures
Oh,
and
I love
processes.
that. Oh, I think that's really profound. Absolutely. That's a real paradigm shift. I mean, it's obvious, but yeah, you want the pressure from that place, not internally. Internally, you want it to be completely self-supporting.
Indeed.
So just as we before we land, I just want to nod back to you said about the power of seven, and a
Yeah.
person can't do, what was it you said? They can't do something beyond seven. They
Well,
can't,
yeah, I try
or
to
not
not
as
make
effective.
bold statements like this, but there's a concept called the span of control,
Yep.
which is it's hard for people to kind of deal with more than seven things. So what you find is that a company of a certain size, you'll find that the layers of hierarchy that they have is some function of a power of seven. So if you've got 1 million employees, I think that'll end up with, I think, 7 to the power of 7 or 8. I can't remember the exact
Yep.
number. So you end up with 7 or 8 hierarchies. If you've got 40 employees, you probably have 2 hierarchies, because it's 7 to the power of 2 is 49. If you've got, well, 49 times 7, let's say, I don't know, 200 and something. So once you reach about 200 employees, you end up with 3 layers of hierarchies. And
Got it.
and those are interesting because they also probably symbolize and map to different transitions that organizations go through when they're scaling. And the fact is that you probably do have to have those 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 hierarchies, but the question is, how can you make them dynamic rather than rigid?
Yeah. I mean, there's something that a model I show is this, you'll know, ambidextrous leadership, and it's this, that the one hand is this agility, experimental, iterative, fresh thinking approach
Yeah,
to project and task and teamwork, and the other though is this sort of the handrails of operational excellence and systems and structures that are quite rigid, but they kind of keep the keep things in the lane. Otherwise, because if you're just doing one without the other, it's like being on a bike pedaling on one pedal only. You'll
yeah.
fall off. And so, I mean, to what extent do you think both are needed, or do you think you only need agility?
I'm a big fan of a concept called anti-fragile,
Oh yeah,
which
I love
is,
it. Yeah,
yeah,
Nassim.
as and the question that I've been asking myself for a long time is, as my company gets bigger, rather than getting kind of slower and more
Clunky.
bureaucratic, how does it become faster and smarter? And and in some respects, so going back to this idea of nodes and relationships between nodes, um, the way that the communication happens between two nodes is a function of the leaders of those nodes. So I think getting the right leadership in place to allow for this structure works, whether that's an ambidextrous leader
Sure.
or what. that's the problem that we need to solve.
I love that. So, yeah, gosh, I want to launch into a whole load of more questioning around that, but I'm not going to because I'm mindful of our time. What I'd love to land on, Daniel, this has just been such a rich conversation, bringing together AI and basic human behavior and all together. What home item do you have that would personify extraordinary leadership?
Home item. I have a thing here, which is like a little like hologram. I don't even know if you can see that, but
Yes.
it's a picture of the Starship Enterprise. So if you're old enough, I'm not sure you are. I used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, and
Oh yeah,
Captain
yeah. I
Picard,
didn't watch it, but I'm with the same
Captain
age. Yeah.
Picard, I think, was an exceptional, extraordinary leader. And I think, if you watch Star Trek, it's really about how do you make tough decisions in adverse situations. And so I think I've learned a lot from Star Trek, and particularly Jean-Luc Picard.
Well, again, it goes back to full circle, back to this whole thing of wisdom and decision making, and you finding frameworks and models and solutions to doing that. You kind of, it's your life's work in a way, isn't it? To
It is.
through use, yeah. Um, Daniel, thank you so much for your time and your insight and wisdom. I would love to have you on the show again. There's just so many other
Happy to.
conversations I'd love to have. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
What has really impacted me from that conversation is actually underneath it all, I think I've got a bias towards hierarchical structures. I didn't realize I did until I heard him talking about his structure of there being nodes of leadership and groups and project groups, and just how different that is from the spaces that I've been exposed to and worked within. And I just wonder for you listening, to what extent has that exposed in you a sense of, gosh, what structures do I live by in my business, in my leadership models that I really need to start addressing and thinking about. The other thing that really impacted me was him bringing in stuff from the therapeutic spaces around attachment theory. And it's something that I'm very interested in. And we'll probably find a psychotherapist to bring in and talk to us more about that, because how that plays out in our business models is really significant. And yet here I am talking to an AI expert. Digital twinning, that really fascinated me, encapsulating really good data on our performance, on how to really help manage our work performance and our task performance, and utilizing AI to really help us with that through digital twinning. That really excited me. I haven't seen enough of that out there in the workplace. So that excited me, but also how Daniel did bring things back to speaking to humans is really important. Knowing people, reading the room, having conversations, that it's not an either or, that AI is to enhance and amplify human greatness as opposed to taking over from it. So if you want to know more about AI in your leadership, I hate to say this, don't contact me because I would not be able to help. However, Daniel would. But if you do want to figure out more around leadership and those spaces of how to have great conversations with people and helping people to dial up in their wisdom, then that is something I could definitely help you with. So do reach out. But if not, I will see you next time with another incredible guest. Take care.